Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. Today, we are going to be talking about Setsuko's Secret. This is a post-war community advocacy and political leadership event. My name is Adina Ishii. I am a student at Santa Clara University School of Law and also a volunteer with the Japanese American Museum of San Jose. This event is especially important to me since my grandparents were incarcerated during World War II. One grandfather served in the military intelligence service and the other served in the 442nd. Today, as I mentioned, we are discussing post-war community advocacy and political leadership. We have an amazing panel today, and I'm very excited to introduce them to you. Today's event is presented by the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. Formed in 1996, the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit. Its mission is to preserve what remains of the World War II Japanese American confinement site in Park County, Wyoming, to tell the stories of the more than 14,000 people unjustly incarcerated at the site. Heart Mountain Interpretive Center is an award-winning, world-class museum dedicated to teaching the story to future generations. Their pilgrimage will be online this year on the 23rd of July. And you can go see their website at www.heartmountain.org. Today's event is also hosted by the Japanese American Museum of San Jose. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a volunteer there. Our mission is to build bridges through inspiration, innovation, and inclusion, and to collect, preserve, and share Japanese American history, culture, and art with a focus on the Greater Bay Area. You can also visit our website at www.jamsj.org. And the website is actually in the chat for you. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. Please feel free to use the chat. There's a Q&A button for you. You can use the chat also to introduce yourself and tell us where you're from. Since this is a community event, we really want to make sure that folks get to sort of know each other and see who's here. As I mentioned earlier, this event is part of the Setsuko Secret virtual book series. Conversations with people who have played pivotal roles in the Japanese American incarceration story. Today we'll hear civic leaders from the Sansei generation as they talk about what it was like growing up post-war, the activism of their generation, the redress movement, our current political challenges, and where we go from here. Now to kick off the event, here is the Setsuko Secret book trailer. That trailer is always so touching when I watch it. I feel like it's very powerful, and I'm so grateful now to introduce our esteemed panelists and to ask them to turn on their videos as I introduce them. Our first panelist is Shirley Higuchi. She is the chair of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, and she leads the legal advocacy office of the American Psychological Association. Her pursuit of law stemmed from her feelings of discomfort toward how the U.S. judicial system treated her parents, who met as children incarcerated at Heart Mountain. It wasn't until her mother was on her deathbed in 2005 that Shirley learned of her mother's commitment to building something at Heart Mountain so that history wouldn't be forgotten. Thank you for joining us. Next is Assemblyman Warren Furutani. He's an activist and former politician, now senior advisor to LA City Council member Kevin De Leon. Before being elected to the California State Assembly, he served on the LA Unified School District Board of Education and the Community College District Board of Trustees. His parents also met while incarcerated in Rower, Arkansas. As a civil rights activist and one of the most prominent voices of the Asian American movement, he helped many campuses establish ethnic studies programs, and he organized the first pilgrimage to Manzanar. Attorney Dale Minami is recognized as one of the top personal injury lawyers in the San Francisco Bay Area. He's been involved in significant litigation involving the civil rights of Asian Pacific Americans and other minorities. And he headed the legal team that overturned Korematsu versus the United States, which convicted Fred Korematsu for refusing to obey exclusion orders aimed at Japanese Americans during World War II. That conviction was widely considered one of the worst and most racist Supreme Court decisions in American history. Like Assemblyman Furutani, Dale also grew up in Gardena, California, and his parents were incarcerated at Rower. Congressman Mike Honda is a politician and former educator. At less than a year old, he was incarcerated with his family at Higuchi in Colorado during World War II. He has served on the San Jose Planning Commission, School Board, Board of Supervisors, and the California State Assembly, and he spent 16 years serving California's 15th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. He led the Congressional Progressive Caucus and the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus and helped to found the LGBT Equality Caucus. And finally, last but not least, moderating today's event is David Ono, the anchor for ABC-7 Eyewitness News, the top-rated newscast in Los Angeles, and also the newscaster that I grew up watching when I was living in LA. In addition to covering historic global events throughout his career, he is also an award-winning documentary filmmaker, including for the film The Legacy of Heart Mountain. And he's the recipient of 7 Edward R. Murrow Awards and 23 Emmys. He has attended almost every Heart Mountain pilgrimage and was awarded their Compassionate Witness Award. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to pass it over to David. Thank you.
Adina, thank you so much. And hello, everybody. You know, I love hearing people like Adina who say, I grew up watching you. So it kind of goes to show you how long you've been around. Usually they say my parents grew up watching you. So it's always a pleasure. And I have to say, when I was approached about this panel and I saw who was on it, I thought this is unprecedented. This is an amazing opportunity to talk to some true legends within our community, but not just our community, but American history. And you're going to learn so much. They have so much to say. And we'll be bringing in another legend a little bit later on in the show, and that would be Secretary Norman Mineta, who was, you know, adored across the country, but especially in San Jose, his hometown. And he has such a foothold in that community. And he's going to be joining us a little bit later on with some thoughts that are vitally important. But it's great to see everybody. I will say that we will be talking about Setsuko's secret, and I know we're gonna splinter off and talk about a lot of other things when it comes to what's going on in the world today in relation to what happened 75 years ago. But I will tell you, as a personal testament, this is a fantastic book, and this is a chapter in history that I have studied for decades now, and I learned so much. Still, the research that Shirley did, the people in it, some of whom are with us today. Fascinating lives, and these are stories that we all should know more thoroughly, all of us as Americans. So Shirley, congratulations, first of all, on this book. It's fantastic. Real quick reminder before I throw you the first question. Everybody out there, you're welcome to ask some questions. Just a reminder, Throw us your questions. We're going to get to that in the last half hour of this program. And also for our panelists, you guys are fantastic and have fantastic stories, but can you keep your answers very short so we can cover as much ground as possible? But we still are so proud to be able to hear from all of you. Shirley, this book, the broadest of questions, why did you write it and how did you get so much information packed into this book?
Well, that's a very complicated question. I'll try my best to answer it quickly. It really all starts on my mother's deathbed. And basically, Setsuko's secret is that she really never talked about her commitment to Heart Mountain and dreaming of something being built there. We all know that Nisei have been the quiet Americans, haven't talked about their experience of incarceration, and she was one of them. So after her death, I took her position on the board. I was sworn in as chair in 2008. And at that moment, when I was meeting a lot of the Nisei and the incarcerees there, I realized that this is something that I needed to document. It was history in the making. It was stories of meeting Mineta and Al Simpson and the other incarcerees like Tako Shizaki. And I wanted to really take an advantage of recording that the minute I took over as chair.
That's fantastic. And I will say the details, the history that you brought out in this book, the events leading up to the incarceration of Japanese Americans is no simple thing, even though it's often simplified, but going step by step, then this happened, this happened, this happened. It was remarkable to read and see how this can happen or has happened, and it can happen again. And that's why we want to always hold on to these chapters in our history and continue to use them to teach. You write about something called the Sansei effect. That, to me, that's very interesting. Just as a little background, can you give us an idea what the Sansei effect is, how it affected you? And then I'm going to bring in our panelists as well, because they understand it wholeheartedly.
Well, the Sansei effect is a term that I've coined, and I really do believe it's an effect. I think with being a Sansei, we all have our different experiences. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. All my friends were Black or white. There were no Asian Americans there. So that made it really challenging. In addition, there was no information in my history books about the incarceration, and my parents never really talked about it. But when one of the fellow board members that I talked to in depth was Daryl Kunitomi, where I coined that effect with him. And it was striking how there were so many similarities between my own experiences and his. And it really made me realize that there was sort of a multi-generational trauma effect on our generation, even though we really never spoke about it. Our parents, could be controlling. There was issues of perfectionism, striving and getting ahead, but we never really understood, or else I didn't really understand, like, why are we like so competitive? Why are we trying to be number one? Why am I trying to prove myself amongst this community of Black and white individuals? I never really knew where that motivation came from. I mean, I knew that I was going to go to graduate school when I was in like junior high school. I knew I was going to be a lawyer or a doctor, but I didn't really know why, until I, got to college.
And I think what's interesting about you pointing that out in that relationship with you and Daryl Kunitomi, many of us know Daryl. Daryl grew up in Southern California, in LA, kind of the heart of, Little Tokyo and Japanese America. You grew up in Michigan, yet you had similar backgrounds, you had similar facts, and you're both under almost the same situation.
Right. And that's really what derived me to the Sansei effect, because there are a lot of similarities that stretch across the Japanese American community. And I thought I was all alone. I thought I was the only one that was experiencing these things. Mm-hmm. My mom had issues with, sort of really a lot of propriety, wanting me to have certain friends, wanting me to join certain groups, even right down to, who I would date and go out with. And I'm like, who really cares, But I think a lot of it was her way of sort of trying to ensure or control that I sort of stayed on this path, even though I didn't know what path I actually was on. So in many ways, I think, at least for me, and I'll let the other Sanseis talk for themselves, it's a bit confusing when you grow up in an environment that that your parents suffered an extreme trauma, yet nobody really explained to you really what happened.
Hmm. So I want to, okay.
And I was just going to say, and my mom kind of made camp a fun place to be because after all, she met my dad there and they fell in love at Heart Mountain. And I always thought Heart Mountain was a place of love.
Right, and especially with the name Heart Mountain, which is, I mean, that's a beautiful sentiment in some respects. Assemblyman Warren Furutani, I'm sure a lot of what Shirley says kind of resonates with you. And I don't know if our audience realizes the hellion you were as you grew up and with protests and statements and the real civic leader that you were. How does that play into the Sansei effect and what Shirley just described?
Well, I think it's also a context of the times. I graduated from high school in 1965, so in the middle of the 60s. And I grew up in a community, a city, small city called Gardena, which is a suburb of Los Angeles. And the high school I went to, Gardena High School, had 1/4 Japanese, or mostly Japanese and Asian American, 1/4 white, 1/4 black, and 1/4 Latino. So we had this very integrated situation of post-war babies that grew up in a town as a Japanese American where the first mayor on the mainland, Japanese American, the mayor, was elected in Gardena, where we had athletic heroes that played, well, one of them was on our panel, Minami. I know he'll cringe at this, but was a real athletic star in Gardena along with his brother. And people know about Coach Dave Yanai, who's known for his basketball coaching at Dominguez Hills and other Division I schools. They all came from Gardena. So Gardena provided a great place to be Japanese Americans on one hand, but on the other hand, it was so Japanese American that it had all the coming restrictions. You know, you didn't want to stand out. You didn't want to speak up. You wanted to be what the Nisei called the quiet American. And for myself, in our family, my father was a Sansei. He wasn't a Nisei like all my contemporaries' fathers. So my dad talked to us. My dad talked to my friends. My brothers and I, we had the cool dad. Everybody would say, oh, Warren's got a cool dad. He used to ride motorcycles and had hot rods, played jazz, was up on all that was going on. So he was the Sansei, and my mom was a Nisei, but she had 4 older brothers, so she knew about boys. So she was the anchor. So that was the context in which we grew up in. So that provided a real basis to deal with the 1960s. You couldn't be an idle bystander as the world was spinning out of control at that time in the 1960s.
I want to bring in Dale in just a second, but just as a follow-up then, because you said everybody was like that, but not really, because you seem to be the civic leader when it comes to protest, when it comes to being that person to set the example. How did that come to be?
I got pissed off. I got angry. I tried to do everything the way you were supposed to do it. I was that kind of Gardena guy, like every Japanese American. You know, I wasn't a great basketball player like Dale, but I was good enough to make the team. I didn't get the highest grades, but fairly good enough. But my father and mother were different. Yeah. So they didn't have a pre-plan for me to be a doctor. They said, do whatever you want to do. And so when everybody went off to college, I started to become a part of a scene of on the edge of taking drugs and marijuana. And I played guitar and folk music and lived at the beach, and then became very involved in politics through my African-American friends. And when they were dealing with their civil rights movement, it became pretty easy because I heard Stokely Carmichael speak. And he said the most important thing for Black people to do was to define themselves for themselves and by themselves. And I knew I wasn't Black, even though I'll tell you, I could definitely dance. I could dance, but I knew I wasn't Black. But I had an epiphany later on where I just took out Black and I put in the term Oriental, and it said the same thing. If you don't want to be an Oriental and you want to be yourself, you have to take the power to define yourself for yourself and by yourself. And that was the basis of the movement. New identity, new definitions. And just like Shirley said, initially, as I started speaking out, people would say, well, wait a minute, I thought I was the only one that felt that way. And that's what became the start of the movement. It's a recognition that we had a common experience as Japanese Americans and as Asian Americans, because as Asian Americans, immigration was cut off, so that if you were a Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, you were Asian American, because we didn't have a lot of immigration coming in from our mother countries at that time until 1965, we reopened immigration. So that's why it was Asian American. It was also a philosophical, political belief that we would be stronger as, rather than as separate fingers on a hand. If we joined together in a clenched fist, that would give us a power.
Wow, that is a fantastic message. That is so relevant to today as well. So Dale, the stud that you were, and I could tell just by your personality every time I've met with you, you are that aggressive, go-getter kind of guy. I'm not surprised that you are a great athlete, but you grew up in Gardena as well. You saw this. You were in the same environment. What did Mr. Furutani just say that resonates with you in your life, and how, and were there differences?
Yes, I think what Shirley said too is we grew up very much trying to be white, and we didn't promote Japanese culture. My brother and I got kicked out of Japanese school after 2 weeks to play baseball, which is kind of a metaphor. And but in the back of my heart, somewhere locked away, was a sense that there was something wrong. The secret that you're talking about, Shirley, that my folks were incarcerated, and yet, we just saw pictures of, quote, camps. And then when I started watching TV and watched the civil rights movement ignite America and ignite the imagination of Asian Americans, I started to feel some type of some sympathy or empathy for them, and I wasn't sure why. They were just protesting, and people were blowing them away with water cannons and sicking dogs on them. And I have to say, I met Warren playing basketball, of all places, just about. And he had a great influence on my life, because he didn't just become a politician all of a sudden. He evolved into that position. And I remember him organizing the first mass demonstration, or they called it Sinsip. It's picnic spelled backwards.
Oh.
And Japanese Americans got together, and we started to explore the idea of identity. That was 1967. And so I had to move on, and I couldn't stay under the cultish spell of Warren Furutani forever. So I went to Berkeley in law school, and like Warren says, in 1968, in the middle of the 60s, everything seemed to explode, and especially in Berkeley where I was. The civil rights movement, the anti-war protests, the counterculture movement. And so, we were brought into a whole world of third world strikes and what we thought were chaos, but it was a statement by our generation. And it's our statement of our generation writing its own history. So that influenced me a lot. And Gardena, which is exactly what Warren described, it was very confining. And I really wanted to leave to the farthest place I could get culturally and politically. And that was Berkeley. So that's the place I went. And it was years later, Warren and I started hooking up and talking about politics, but he had a great influence on how I decided to merge what he said about the African American movement into the Asian American movement, to understand the kind of oppression that was common to all of us, the history of racism. And that set me on my path. And the one thing that Warren said that I think just now was one of the motivating factors was simple outrage. That the promises made to us were not really American dreams. They were American nightmares because of the racism. And that, to me, motivated me to continue to move on.
I think it's fascinating that, so Warren had his way of fighting back. You found your way to fight back. You guys are all heroes. Congressman Honda, you too. You start by fighting for better education. Then you go to Congress for 16 years and you fight in Washington, D.C. And by the way, you're muted, just to let you know. How does all this kind of fit into the Sansei effect for you? Because you did find your own way to continue to fight as well.
Yeah, and I guess I would look at my life from after high school to about 1968, from graduating from high school to coming back from Peace Corps in El Salvador. And prior to the high school, growing up in Chicago for almost 10 years, my father was sent to Northwestern University to teach Japanese language to the Naval Intelligence Officer with the MIS. And unlike other Niseis, my father used to tell me the things that happened in camp, and he would describe the camp in ways that I would understand. And he would say, you know, if we were there for our security, national security, he would raise a question, even back then, so why are we behind the barbed wires and why are the machine gun nests pointed in at us? And he said that America has made a grave mistake. But he kept telling me as I was growing up that, you know, you are who you are, and when you leave the door of our apartment, remember, you gotta be like a good mirror. You have to be a good reflection of us. So that was kind of the thing that controlled me when I left the house until I came back at night, that, you know, I was supposed to behave in ways that was a good reflection, because my father always said that if I find out you're misbehaving, I expect them to punish you, and then you can come home and expect the punishment here. So, you know, behave yourself and act like your mom's right next to you all the time. Well, I didn't know till later that my first language was Japanese, because my mom was, she was born here in San Jose, but raised in Japan, in Kumamoto. And my father was born here, and his parents are from Kumamoto. And he enjoyed learning languages. Well, while in Chicago, he taught me a couple of things that stayed with me till now, is saying my name properly, and then also not accepting derogatory comments about yourself, because he heard me play Army outside the apartment that we lived in, because I just saw John Wayne's Sands of Iwo Jima.
Oh yeah.
And I learned one phrase that stuck with me, and I used that when I was playing war. And I said, we're gonna get those bandy-legged lemon-colored nips. And I repeated that all the time while I was playing war outside. My father said,
Oh no.
do you understand what you're saying? Because he called for me from the third floor, and I heard his voice saying, Mike, come up here. And I said, oh, that's like the voice of God, you know. I must have done something wrong. Well, he was trying to straighten me out about certain things. But, you know, all through high school, you know, I grew up in front of the TV set and never saw my face there.
Right.
The only time I saw it was when Bonanza got there, and that was Hop Sing. So there was nothing that was positive about reflecting, you know, my background, my face, my experience, until I got to college. And then in college, I saw some books from the stacks that was documents from the WRA. I flipped those books, and I saw pictures of San Jose J-Town, people from J-Town. And then I started to pull things together and start to reflect on my own experiences, the things I remember, what my father taught me, what he said about camp. And I started to understand that my lack of self-esteem was that there was nothing out there reinforcing who I was other than what my family did. And so I started to work on picking and choosing characteristics from other folks, like from Norm and from Dale and from Warren and from other folks that I wanted to be able to embody. And when I came back from Peace Corps, I had an attitude of that the government does lie to us and that we have to change things. And about that time, the mantra was, if you're not part of the problem, you got to be part of the solution. Or if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And so my style started to be getting involved in the institutions, to change within the institutions, and trying to see what I can learn and make some changes within the structure. So as a teacher, I just wanted to make sure that the kids, especially kids who were non-white and who had language difficulties, that they got a fair break or at least an attention, and an understanding that I didn't want them to go through the same things I did. But I wasn't able to perfect it until years later. And so working in the system taught me that we have to try to make those changes, and you got to have the steel to be able to do that. And that's why watching Norm, making sure that certain things did happen, in spite of the fact there's a lot of the popular movement was contrary to what he was promoting, like diversity, inclusion in city council, being able to make sure that his experience was shared with other people, and his experience became part and part of policy that he was involved with. And thus he became a leader in the formation of the HR 442, and working with Dale and the rest of the folks, you know, after 10 years in Congress, finally passed the HR 442, which was only an apology and a recognition of misstep by the government. But we still need to do more in terms of how to avoid the constant rhetoric of gathering people up who are different, who are immigrants, and incarcerating them for one reason or another.
So, Mike, I just want to clarify, your parents also met in camp, didn't they?
No.
Oh, they didn't? I thought, no, okay, clarify.
No, my father met my mother in Kumamoto, because
oh, okay.
when he was in town, the town folks knew that my mom was born in San Jose and my father was from California. Therefore, they should meet. Well, they got together, and when I saw my father and mother's picture in the 1930s, she was a knockout. And he wasn't too bad to look at either, but you know, then they continued the relationship in California when they both came back.
Oh, okay. California. That's it. I wanted to clarify because I think that's interesting about Shirley's parents meeting in camp. Did any panelists, did any of your parents meet in camp like Shirley's did? No.
My parents met in camp.
Oh, they did. Maybe I was thinking of you then. Was that Rower or which camp was it? In Rower. Okay. Yeah. So they were in Arkansas. So it's a similarity there as well. I find it interesting though, Shirley, if I want to bring you back in, you've just heard from these gentlemen who are all legends in their own right and have done so much hard work in their lives when it comes to the legacy of Japanese Americans and kind of getting back and fighting back. Obviously, that's part of your goal as well with your book is to kind of not just educate, but help us understand so we don't continue on with that. How are people like the Furutanis and the Hondas and the Minamis, how do they inspire you when it comes to writing this book?
Well, I mean, I think that we all sort of inspire each other. And I agree with Mike that, you know, it was really important, I think, given our fact that we didn't know much about our family history and our suffering, that we look to role models like Norm, Mineta, and others. I mean, you got to step back. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So I was almost 3 or 4 steps away from the Japanese American community and that exposure. But I thought it was really interesting what Warren and Mike and Dale had said. I mean, another symptom of the Sansei effect is anger, is being angry. And I heard that come up with Warren and Dale and Mike. I'm not quite sure how angry you were, but anger was like kind of a go-to kind of reaction I have. When growing up. Another issue is fear and anxiety. I mean, Mike talked about, you know, esteem issues, but here I grew up around all blacks and whites in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I remember, and I'm about 10 to 15 younger than the other panelists. So age does make a difference. But I remember when George Wallace was running for president. And, you know, here I'm with all blacks and whites growing up, not quite sure am I black or am I white, who am I? I remember going and climbing up a tree in my parents' backyard and literally crying because I was so afraid that George Wallace was going to win the presidency, and I didn't know why I was crying.
Mm.
Isn't that weird? Like,
Mm.
why was I afraid of George Wallace when I was only a kid? I was like, in elementary school then. And, I don't know why I was afraid, but now when I look back, I was afraid that if he would become president, I would be hanging from a tree.
Mm.
And it's funny, I was in a tree crying. So I don't know what that analogy is, but I think that you grow up being afraid, but not really knowing why, or being anxious or looking behind you and being like kind of one step ahead of everyone, because you just don't know what's going to happen next.
Right.
It's sort of a fear-based reaction of growing up.
It's interesting when you say that story, and there's so much relevance to today in all of your stories, actually. Relevance today, how divided we are as a country. Black Lives Matter over the summer, we see a rash of Asian hate rising up again right now on our streets over coronavirus and how Asians are seen, et cetera, just complete and pure ignorance. Mr. Furutani, what you learned in your activism as you mobilize fellow Asians back then, what did you learn back then that can be applied to today as people rise up in our current world and say, enough is enough and it's time to fix some of our problems?
The context in the 60s, and Dale referenced it when he was at Cal, everything was what was called third world, what we now call people of color. It wasn't just one group standing all by themselves. San Francisco State had the Third World Liberation Front. Berkeley had Third World Coalition. I worked at the College of San Mateo, was a student there, and we had a program called the College Readiness Program, which was Blacks, Latinos, American Indians, whites, and Asians. That was always the context. Just like the context was always Asian American, not just Japanese American, because it was all based on common ground. That common ground was a common experience. It had different textures, different examples, but it had the same foundation. The systemic racism, the prejudice, what you had to do to overcome that. You had to work twice as hard. We had heroes in our communities and women in our communities that were making strides and making changes after post-war. But the person I emulated wasn't Norm Mineta when I was involved early on. It was Malcolm X, it was Stokely Carmichael, it was the Black Power movement, Cesar Chavez. It wasn't even Dr. King. We weren't about nonviolence, we were about fighting back. And it's because really looking at the issues at hand, that was the kind of response we felt that was needed, not just turning the other cheek, but you had to take a stand. You had to draw a line in the sand and defend that line and get across it and break down doors, open barriers. And that wasn't going to be happening by being real nice about things. You learn about the power of nonviolent demonstrations as you become more astute to how to organize and demonstrate. But in terms of what was motivating people in the context, which is something I'm a little concerned about these days, Black Lives Matters, absolutely. But that's got to be in the context of all people. We have to look at how we're going to raise everybody's boat. Their boat definitely was worse than anybody else's. I get it. But in terms of looking at the 60s and the 70s, the context was more broader. It was more based upon people looking at common ground around fighting for justice, fighting against injustice. And that's where the camp issue sort of revisited. Because for Japanese Americans, and if you look at any ethnic studies programs, it started based upon two things. One, the Asian American experience, and two, Asian American history. So since there was nothing in the books, like Shirley said, we had to go find our own history. So you went to the community and you got first person history, and then you had some people that had been studying history beyond just the immediate generations. And one of the things that just stuck up like a red flag was the camp. Because every one of us as Japanese Americans knows that the discussion about camp would come up at Thanksgiving, at a birthday party, at Oshogatsu, usually in hushed tones, or someone would giggle about it because they were Nisei, so they didn't feel the brunt of the economic blow like the Issei did. But camp was always the touchstone. I mean, after they asked about what kind of job you had, what kind of car you drove, and where you lived, then the next question was, what camp was your family in? What camp were you in? And then if they could identify the camp, then they would ask, what block were you in? And then did you know so-and-so? So it's been a constant point of a touchstone, as it were, for our community. And the Manzanar pilgrimage, the first one we did, a friend of mine, Victor Shibata, and I came up with the idea because we were saying to ourselves as activists at that time, the farm workers had just marched to Sacramento. That was galvanizing the farm workers movement. There was a Poor People's March in Washington, D.C. that was galvanizing the civil rights with the Poor People's Campaign. Asians got to march somewhere. That was what Victor and I were saying. We got to march somewhere, damn it. And we said, what about those camps? So our first idea was we were going to march from Los Angeles to Manzanar. And then, of course, we got out a map and said, well, maybe not that far. So we said, let's go to the edge of LA County. We'll march from there. No, that's too far. So Victor and I went up there. We got some basic landmarks from some people that would say, there's this big green building. You drive by it when you go up to June Lake to go fishing for trout. So the Japanese American knew that route for sure. And we followed that basic descriptions and found the camp. And then the galvanizing of this issue around the pilgrimage was sort of the first real manifestation. There was talk, it was referenced. We had people like Yuri Wada and others, Nisei, that were speaking out loud about it. Yuji Ichioka talked about reparations way back in the 60s, but the pilgrimage galvanized it, particularly for the Sansei. Because we went up there and we used to think, well, how come the Nisei didn't fight back? Then we found out about the history of the leadership of the community being taken out, people coming to your doors with bayonets on the end of their guns. How could you fight back? And then we found out when you got to Manzanar, it was cold. We were so ignorant, not stupid, but ignorant, that we went on the first Manzanar pilgrimage on the week between Christmas and New Year's.
Oh.
Nobody goes to the Upper Owens Valley unless you're going to June Mountain to ski during that time. So we got an object lesson in the reality of camp.
That's incredible. That's a beautiful story in so many ways. And I guess a huge thank you to you, because the pilgrimages, and Shirley could speak to this as well, but the pilgrimages are so important in allowing us to fully understand their impact within our community, and also why we should continue to remember that. So, thank you very much for doing that. That is a beautiful piece of history. Dale, if I could bring you back in, I eventually want to get to that brilliant court case of yours and Fred Korematsu. But before we get to that, I want to kind of finish this part of the conversation. That is, as an attorney, and you see our world today, and you're muted, by the way, as an attorney and you see our world today, how does that bring back your memories as well of back then when there was this massive civil rights movement? What is good and bad about what you're seeing?
I think what I see now is an echo of history. And that echo resounded with Trump versus Hawaii, when he banned an entire, essentially Muslim country group from coming to this country. And the court in this case has repeated the mistake in Korematsu, which is to defer to the military without any evidence of, without any proper evidence that there was a danger. And so what I'm seeing now is like a repeat at one level. Recently, President Biden, rescinded that order that excluded Muslims. So I think that's a good sign. I do see that what happened in World War II to the Japanese Americans was a breakdown of our democracy. And what it was is a failure of the checks and balances system we all learned about. And we came perilously close to that. If we didn't win 2016 Congress, we would have had a repeat almost. And it would have been a president who had just no limitations on his power. So what I'm fearing is that checks and balance system that is totally out of whack and became out of whack mostly after September 11. It started evolving into a presidential imperial presidency. So going back to those days, and seeing the type of racism that occurred against Japanese Americans, and understanding history about the discrimination and violence against, from Chinese, the largest mass lynchings in history in 1871, to Japanese Americans, to the murder of Vincent Chin, to the discrimination against Muslim and Arabs after September 11th. That resuscitation of hate is recurring today, and it's large part through the misleading demagoguery of the president and his colleagues. I mean, we know that the rivers of racism run very deep in this country, and in fact have always been there, and have, the racism helped build this country. And in times of crisis or fear or insecurity, those rivers run over. And so it creates this type of anti-Asian violence atmosphere that is very scary and very dangerous right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you put it so succinctly. This is history repeating itself over and over and over again. And there needs to be a real examination on, I would say, the manipulation of power when it comes to the executive office. And and that's what I mean about tying this into today with the civil unrest that we're seeing, with the protests going on, with people seeing blatant abuses of power. What can we do about it? How do we bring back and feel safe about our government again in a legal standpoint?
From a legal standpoint, there's not much you could do. I have a deep skepticism of the law, and especially the Supreme Court now. I think this whole battlefield is in politics, and it's in people power. It's maybe trite to say, but that's what we all believed in the 60s. But I honestly believe that we need to marginalize those extremists, and we need to, and it's happening to some degree when 140,000 Republicans changed their registration in the last month. And so that the Republican Party needs to reclaim itself, and reclaim its heart, and become a party, even if it's you disagree with them, but not a party of extremists, a party that seeks to undermine democracy. So what Warren said before is like, you got to fight back. You just can't take it passively, or we're going to be victims of history. So I think it's back to organizing. It's back to peeling off the folks who really believe in the democracy, who may not believe in the same values you or same issues you have, but at least believe in the essential value of a democratic process.
Right. It's almost like we crave legitimate debate on the issues. That's fine. Disagree with my issues, but don't bring in conspiracy theories, and don't step on my civil rights. Congressman Honda, so you went from the school board, you went into Congress, you fought in your own ways on civil rights, and by the way, you're muted again as well. What is happening today that concerns you, and can we bring those lessons that you learned as a young man growing up, trying to figure out what this world is all about? What lessons back then can we carry with us today to help us get through this time?
Yeah, Shirley talked about the anger, and I guess I would couch my anger in terms of learning about my community, my family, and camp, and not being taught about it in schools. The issue for me was I really felt cheated in time and the kinds of things that could have been taught along with other things or integrated with other things. So that's what motivated me to be a teacher. But what's going on now and then was, one is the lack of knowledge. If we look at the Constitution and we look at some of the immigration laws all the way up to today, it's fraught with discrimination, and actually immigration is about discrimination. And in understanding our laws and how to change that, you have to be part of that system to be able to go in there and say, we got to eliminate some of these laws because we say that we're a nation of laws. Well, that's horsepucky, because, you know, we have laws that are unconstitutional, but legal. But legal. We have laws that are immoral, but it's legal. And so we have to be able to determine how to, you know, just glean out these kinds of laws and eliminate them so that it doesn't become a basis for a lot of other nonsense that these politicians do. The other thing is we don't have a core principle of ethics and morality in terms of it being tied to the Constitution. And if we don't have that kind of a center, then, you know, we're gonna be lost in terms of being able to make decisions on policy or initiating a movement and things like that. So I think the lack of information, being ignorant, and now with 442 passed, that information is out there. So anybody that talks about internment is stupid. And so we can, today, I think we're in a better place in terms of being able to determine what the hell's going on. The problem is that in Congress, we have all these policymakers, decision makers for this country who don't have a backbone. You know, they don't have a backbone. And it doesn't matter what party you're in. And if you don't have a backbone, you can't determine how to write a bill, because this opioid thing, that was passed by both parties and signed by President Obama. And we got duped in it because they the pharmaceuticals figured out how to put people into the process and write that bill and get it passed. So we have to be more astute, more knowledgeable, and be able to determine right from wrong, constitutional and unconstitutional, and be able to sustain that kind of thing on a daily basis in our behavior, in our policy making, so that, you know, our kids don't have to be, and newcomers don't have to be subject to the kind of racism that's really embedded in our system and the way we do things.
Yeah. God, we are flying through this. We only have a few more minutes before we open up to audience questions, and we're also going to hear from Secretary Mineta. But so I'm going to have some very pointed questions for each one of you for one more round. But Shirley, the whole pilgrimage thing came up, and I find that really fascinating from what Mr. Furutani told us about creating that Manzanar pilgrimage. That pilgrimage is so important to you. This book wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Heart Mountain and pulling people over there. And you yourself learned so much through Heart Mountain, through what your mother's hopes were. Tell us a little bit more about that as you think about how organically this first pilgrimage was organized by Warren Furutani. Oh, you're muted, sorry.
I think the one thing that Warren really identified when he created and began the Manzanar movement with the pilgrimage is I found that these pilgrimages are not only about education, but it's also a place of healing. It's a place where Japanese Americans and like-minded individuals can actually come together and mourn and learn about what happened there. And there's something about the power of place. So I knew at one point after the museum had opened up, there were questions bantering around, should we continue to have pilgrimages? And I thought it was a no-brainer. But after getting to know Dr. Satsuki Ina and her work with Tule Lake and also with Sura for Solidarity, I realized that there's a need for us as a community to continue to talk about what happened to our families and to use those experiences to educate the world on what happened and what could happen, and look to ways to prevent many things that are happening today. The stuff that Dale brought up and Mike brought up and Warren, I mean, it's all happening again. And when Warren talked about his closeness to the African-American community and who he identified of the African-American community, I actually had done the same thing. I mean, I had a lot of Black friends growing up, and I was drawn to the Black community. And you kind of wonder, like, why was I so drawn to the Black community? Because I think when push comes to shove, in many ways, I'm more Black than I am white. And, you know, anything goes haywire, people are going to look, they don't care whether I can't speak Japanese. They're going to see an Asian face and they're going to treat me as an Asian. And I'm subject to as much discrimination as anyone else who's Asian. Just because I'm American and because I went to law school doesn't make me immune from harassment. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the reason why both Warren and I were attracted to the African-American community, because we knew that, you know, civil rights and advocacy is the one thing down the road that'll get us out of a bad place. Mm-hmm. And what happened to, you know, Japanese Americans during World War II was a constitutional failure and a political failure, which is what we're seeing today.
Right. I mean, we've all been asked, every person with an Asian face has been asked, where are you from? And even just between the lines, what does that imply? You know, you're not American, you're from somewhere else. So I think everybody can relate to what you just said. So Warren, how do we take things like Shirley's wonderful book, the fight that you had in the 60s and 70s, the pilgrimages, the story of Japanese Americans from World War II, how do we take that and pull it into today and help our country deal with its current situation?
Dale mentioned, and you know, I'm sure it's going to be talked about as, you know, the old timer saying it, but he talked about people power. And although we're identifying me with the Manzanar pilgrimage, I didn't do it by myself. Dale didn't do the legal stuff by himself. Mike, all of us, Dr. Mineta, we're all part of a movement. That's the key, is to rebuild a movement, a people's movement, a people's power. And that the issue of the camps for me and the pilgrimage, I wanted to call it the Manzanar March. And then Victor and I were saying, oh, that don't quite sound right. It sounds like a song that Philip Sousa would write. Or Victor came up with the term pilgrimage. Pilgrimage, the going back, the revisiting, the touchstone, what Shirley said, the re-examining, sometimes digging up old feelings. So we've been doing that, and we have a really great base in the Japanese American community in terms of being organized, in terms of skill set, in terms of ethics. We have a great community to work with. But in terms of taking that to the next place, working in coalition with other communities, finding out where the common ground is. And I've been a very strong proponent and advocate talking about how different we are and how unique we are. Maybe we need to turn around and find out and reestablish that common ground. What do we all believe in? That's our fundamental basis to move forward a people's agenda, a real agenda that speaks to the people's need, not to corporate profits. We know all the sloganeering, but in terms of really looking at people establish what Mike Honda said, an ethic, you know, being nice to each other, treating people with respect, all of these basic things that are not just American, they're universal. And this is the kind of world that we want for the future, rather than an abusive one where we're abusing the environment, abusing other people, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how it seems to come around to me. I'm a senior fellow at UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs, and I work with graduate students. I am so heartened by these young people coming out of UCLA, their spirit, their sense of purpose, how they view the world. I'm really enthusiastic about the younger generations, the new ideas, the new technologies. I mean, all of us are old organizers. We're used to smelling ditto fluid and getting high when we made our leaflets on the ditto machine. But now the technology available relative to communication. But another thing, and I really appreciate you, David, for being such an asset and resource to the community. It's like taking all of these resources, putting them together to develop a real agenda for change, a real agenda that's positive, taking our communities and really fulfilling to our fullest potential. That's what the American dream is about. and making sure that as we fight for our own community, we're fighting for everybody else's as well.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Warren. I really appreciate that. We all appreciate all you've done too. Dale, I have to, because we're about to open up to the audience and some other things, but I have to ask you quickly, this Fred Korematsu case, you led the team that overturned it. It was one of the most racist rulings in the history of the Supreme Court, and you fixed it. Just reflecting back, what are your thoughts about that? How does that make you feel? How did that make your family feel? As you look at it today in the divided world that we live in, what comes to mind for you? And you're muted, by the way.
You know, going back to Korematsu, I think we were just lucky. We were lucky we found great evidence by Warren's mother-in-law, Aiko Yoshinaga Herzog, and Peter Irons. And it was the right time to do what we were doing, because once we found the evidence that showed that the government absolutely lied to the Supreme Court by saying that Japanese Americans were disloyal, they were guilty of espionage, what turned out to be total lies that were admitted by the attorneys for the government, even in writing. So we had a good case, and bringing those cases brought us full circle, and full circle because of all the hurdles our parents had to go through to get us an education and let us go to law school. And then we could turn around and use legal skills to help them, to vindicate them, to rehabilitate their political heritage. So that was one of the most satisfying parts of it. We also got to retry history, and that's such a rare thing, to be able to teach this country what the true facts were, and that the government had, in fact, lied about the Japanese Americans. And finally, we got to, validate these three brave men who stood up and challenged the government when no one else was. They were too old, too young, too sick, too scared, and they were able to do this a second time. So that was terrifically gratifying. We kind of didn't realize what we did. We thought our work was finished. And then the Persian Gulf War occurred, then September 11th. And unfortunately, Korematsu became relevant again. Relevant in the sense of what is the power of the government during a time of national security. And we saw that again in Trump versus Hawaii. So what we won is a small victory in a way, it was big then, turned out to be just another one. Because in the end, the Supreme Court deferred to the president. That's the danger, that the Supreme Court will not act as a check and balance, that it will not examine the motives, the extrajudicial statements of a president, and allow that president to then do great harm to the checks and balance system. So I'm ambivalent right now, and I'm hoping that, with new president and with the revitalized people's power, that we can actually accomplish some change.
Yeah, I found myself on the anchor desk reading about your case when it comes to the travel ban, being very proud that I knew the key players in that case and what you were able to do. And it also, obviously, as you mentioned, it is starkly relevant to our world today.
Can I just say one quick thing, David? And it'd be fast. I have to say that the interconnectedness that Warren speaks about is an interconnectedness that affected me greatly personally, because Warren was like my touchstone. He had been my North Star in terms of politics just throughout the years. And the fact that he stayed the course and continued to fight for social justice was an inspiration to me. And the same is true of Mike Honda, to see what he was doing in Congress, and also Norma Mineta, who's still here today fighting the good fight. These are people that inspired me to continue to do what I'm doing. And finally, it's seeing these young folks who organize this to stand up and correct all of the mistakes that we probably made, and to see that we have a chance for a better world because we have an activist young folks who are fighting for social justice too. That is very heartening to me.
That's great. That's a great point. And you didn't make mistakes. They just have to carry on the fight and go to the next level. We really appreciate that. Mr. Honda, I don't want to throw you a wrench, but I think this is one of the key parts of what's wrong with America, and that is ignorance. I mean, it's already been brought up here. What we teach, how we teach people, we don't teach this in our classrooms. We don't teach a lot of the lessons about systemic racism in our classrooms. And then when people have to start digesting these stories that are coming out today. They say that's bull. It didn't happen, or this is made up, or this is. So again, you're muted. How do we fix this? You're a person who's been on the front end of education. You've been a politician. You've been fighting this. How do we fix ignorant Americans? Because in my personal belief, I think that's our biggest problem.
Yeah, thank you. And I think Dale and Warren and Shirley brings out the issues of we have to be factual. We have to tell our story, and our story it's real. And when we share it, it permeates throughout our communities. But we also have to be able to document it and put it in our curriculum and redesign our curriculum. And the way we teach history, it's siloed from one person to one group from another, and it's not integrated. And we don't talk about what really is the real issue when we talk about manifest destiny. And it's about white power, Aryan philosophy moving across this country, and then to the histories of different folks that got involved in the formation of our country. You know, the blacks say that, African American history is American history. We're all involved. Well, same as with us, and we have to be able to do that. So Shirley's book is critical that people start to document their family history because it's part and parcel of the larger history. So that's part of the truth that needs to be told. Your documentary that you put together for the book trailer, that's a powerful way of teaching and communicating with people, far more powerful now in today's technology than us going from neighborhood to neighborhood and organizing. The last thing would be, it's not the last thing, but I think one of the critical thing is what we learned from Norm and Alan Simpson, Republican, Democrat, Senator, House of Representatives, and moving on, from young people that made a connection and then reconnected again, and then formed that coalition or that alliance to work together because they knew each other as people, as kids. And so, and that story, really comes again with a guy named Floyd Morey, and his roommate in this California State Assembly was Bill Thompson. Now, Bill Thompson eventually became chair of the Ways and Means in Congress, and he was the most powerful person in Congress. Everybody was afraid of him. If he didn't get his way, then he would get mean. And that, so being chair of the Ways and Means Committee became important. But the key was Floyd shared his camp experience with Bill when they were roommates. And then when I got in Congress, Floyd was still active, Bill was chairman. They came and said, we want to put a bill together on grants and monies for confinement sites. And I said, I'm on. And the reasoning for that was because camps, whether they're with the WRA or the DOJ, Department of Justice, Crystal City, those camps are a physical representation of our past, but they present a point of education and a point of departure to tell all the stories that come out of these camps, like Shirley's this. And so when we introduced our bill, I asked Bill to go first because he was senior. And here's the key. Bill could not start the press conference without weeping first. He wept. And that's how deep that story went with this really hardcore, right-wing, conservative Republican, because of what Floyd was able to tell the story about camp. So if we keep telling our stories and we keep learning the stories of the refugees and the immigrants, the things that we've done to other people, and turn that back into a success story, that these are the things that we should be avoiding, and in embracing people as we would as we should in the Constitution, to embrace them and make them part of our country, and understand that every move needs to be a move of compassion and inclusion, and not of discrimination and exclusion. And so that if we teach that, I think that we can move forward. And I feel much more confident in what we're going to be able to do, because if we really look at what Lauren and Dale and Norma had done in terms of establishing laws and turning around past wrongdoings, that's a pattern that we should be following, and we should be looking at and replicating with ourselves and with our upcoming generation. Because one thing that is apparent to me, there's a thread between what Aiko did, found the smoking gun, to Warren's mother-in-law, his activism, to Dale, and Dale's work with Norm, and the 10 years that they struggled in Congress, came out with a bill, an unprecedented apology from the US government. And that became a basis for the whole, a better basis for this discussion about reparations for slavery. Because a government, no matter what time of the history it is, the government is still an organic organism that's responsible for its past, its present, its future. And we have to hold our government's feet to the fire to keep pushing on the idea of this concept and the debate that's in the future for us. And that is the question of reparations and what do we do with that?
Right. Reparations was so important in getting the Japanese American story out there through the hearings, through the apology from Ronald Reagan. It could do the same thing for African Americans. Can you only imagine what would come out from that?
Sure.
Thank you so much for saying that. And then again, reiterating that a lot of this stuff that we're talking about is in Shirley's book, and you can learn an enormous amount of that. But I want to bring in another legend, and you've heard his name a whole bunch of times today. That would be Secretary Norman Mineta. He joined us as well, and it's so wonderful to have him, especially here. He's always so supportive of these kinds of panels and bringing in his knowledge and his wisdom. But Secretary Mineta, I wanted to kind of throw a really broad question at you because of this particular panel, and that is, you're from San Jose. There's an airport named after you. You're the first Asian American to be the mayor of a large U.S. city, the first to be a cabinet secretary. You were twice a cabinet secretary for a Republican and a Democrat, which is remarkable. Looking back at your childhood, you were incarcerated in Heart Mountain as a young boy, and all you've accomplished, but yet we are still here talking about this issue today. What goes through your mind as you see the world we live in, but also look back at the incredible body of work that you've had? And Norma, we don't see you, nor do we hear you if you are there. You know, he was here earlier.
Yeah, he might have stepped away from his.
He might have stepped away. Okay, well, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to questions from the audience. Okay, the first one, and then let me know when you get a hold of Norm, everyone. Let's see. We're going to start with. Says this is from Preston Jordan. So Preston, thank you for writing this. And by the way, we have many questions from the audience here. From the panelists' understanding of events leading to internment, did misinformation play as strong a role then as now? If so, what were the means and modes of disinformation in the U.S. then versus now? It's a good question and a complex one. But does anyone want to handle that question about misinformation back then compared to our world today?
That sounds like a Dale question.
Yeah, it's actually one of the parallels, because the misinformation about Japanese Americans is a danger, Japanese Americans is a threat, was widely circulated by major columnists in this country. And so the same misinformation about Muslims, about Arabs, that happened today, and the kind of information about the fraud on the elections, those are absolute misinformations that affected in a sense, the course of history. I think the difference is that, the information was spread and circulated in different ways. This time, it was through the social media more so. And the lies were just as big, but because of the breadth of the social media, we saw far more lies that were repeated and shared. And it was a lot easier to spread lies, which is done. It was done just like the Hitler theory, the big lie. You tell the lie enough and people are going to start to believe it. So I think absolutely misinformation were central to the election of Trump and to the incarceration of Japanese Americans. And I see Norm back in here, so I don't want to take any of his time either.
Great. Well, it's great. Thank you for handling that question, Dale. We appreciate that. And Secretary Mineta, welcome. It's a real honor to have you. We've had a vibrant discussion about the old days as well as today's world as well. And you being a native son of San Jose, I would love to hear your thoughts of how you've gone from being a little boy taken away to incarceration and then still finding a way to get to the very top of government and make a huge difference. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, without a doubt, December 7 was a very, turning point for all of our lives. And I remember that when the placards went up, and it said, "Attention, all those of Japanese ancestry, alien and non-alien." And I'm a 10-year-old kid, and I look at that sign, and I said to my brother, who's 9 years older, I said, "Who's a non-alien?" He says, "That's you." He says, "I'm not a non-alien. I'm a citizen of the United States." And that's why to this day, and I'm now 89, I still cherish the word citizen, because my own government would not use that term to describe us. Now, when's the last time that any of you stood on a chair, beat your chest and said, "I'm a proud non-alien of the United States"? You haven't. And so, I mean, this is the kind of thing that sort of sets you off. And, I'm 10 years old, so it really didn't mean that much, other than the fact that I was very disturbed to be referred to as a non-citizen. I mean, at Jefferson Grammar School, we used to always fight as to who got to carry the flag every morning at the Pledge of Allegiance. So, I mean, these kinds of things really started that trail for us, I think. And when you think about when the 442nd was put together, and they needed, something like 3,000, and yet 8,000 people volunteered. And so there was this pent-up patriotism within us, and but it was one that came culturally, because our parents always told us, obey authority. So that meant obey parents, obey teachers, obey police, obey government. And that, I think, also added to why there was this lack of resistance, so to speak, to the evacuation and incarceration. And I remember when we were doing the redress legislation in 1979, and the Sansei at the time were saying, "Well, why didn't you lay down in front of the trains, or why didn't you lay down in front of the buses?" Well, you got to figure that civil disobedience did not start until the 60s, after the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were adopted. And there's this about the whole tactic about how or why things didn't happen in 1942. And the other thing is that the leaders of the community were unable to talk to anybody, mayor, members of the state legislature, Congress, whomever. And then you had people like Earl Warren, who was the Attorney General of the state of California, running for governor, who was one of the big names pushing for evacuation and incarceration. So it was a totally different time. But today, young people have not only the knowledge, but they also have different other ways of addressing the issue. And social media is a big thing. The whole issue of being able to get on the internet and be able to spread the word out relatively easily and readily is a new device that we didn't have at the time. So it does make a difference today when people want to get their message out. So again, to me, the young people today are so much more advanced in terms of where they are not only socially, but in terms of knowledge about how to go about doing things.
Thank you for your input, Secretary Mineta. And Secretary Mineta has accomplished so much and had a remarkable friendship with Senator Alan Simpson. And Shirley, you've created something called the Mineta Simpson Institute. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the Mineta Simpson Institute is more than just an additional building that we're building onto the museum. And by the way, we're going to be replicating that conference center from the historical photos of the mess halls, which at the camp was a very common gathering place. But essentially, we're seeing this center as an institute to begin exploring, bipartisan ideas and solutions in terms of working across the aisle, exemplifying Norm Mineta and Al Simpson's lives. And I think that this had come up during the program, and I know a couple of our audience members asked about what are the best practices for our government? What are the lessons of incarceration? Look back at what Warren had just mentioned earlier about the need for friendship, civility, kindness, openness, transparency. Those are the lessons that we want to hearken back to bring fast forward. And what you really, if you really think about it, building the Heartmount Interpretive Center was a pretty impressive feat. And it wasn't done by me, it was done by our community. And I have had the support of the local Wyoming community and Wyoming at large. Even though Wyoming is a red state, they have really embraced this concept. They've embraced our center. And I couldn't have done it without the support of the Simpson family. I mean, if I call Al Simpson, he picks up the phone. The same thing with Norm. And so I kind of learned firsthand, the honesty and the truthfulness of these two men. And I want to share those experiences and try to, convince one person at a time to believe in what we all believe on this panel. And the other thing is, I've been asked before by you, David, you had asked me, what audience did you write this book for? Who did you write this book for? And when I really think about it, I think I wrote this book for the people that don't understand. Not the people that understand, the people that don't understand. And that's what this Mineta Simpson Institute is going to do, is to teach people to understand. And we, by the way, we do have an NEH grant where we're bringing in 75 teachers this summer. We're going to be doing it virtually, but those teachers will be educated on the Mineta Simpson Institute concepts, and they'll be taking the curriculum and the information back to their school systems across the United States. We've got, I think, one teacher from almost every area and jurisdiction.
That's great. And I really encourage people to, you know, it's not built yet, but it's in the process. But even just to go to the Hard Mountain pilgrimage, it is just, it's a remarkable experience, and what a beautiful place it is, especially if you go in the summer. Don't go in the winter. It's pretty brutal out there. But as we've kind of learned from Warren's story when at Manzanar and that first pilgrimage, I want to get to one last question real quickly because we're just about out of time, but I think it's fitting. And this comes from Mas Hashimoto, and he asks, what's going to happen to the Nikkei Nation in the future when us older folks are gone? And I think that's an important question because if I can amend it a little bit, and then what would you like to see occurring that helps us understand this and become a better world? And why don't we start with Warren there? What do you think about that? What's the future of the Nikkei Nation?
I think that's a really great question because as we talk about camp, as we talk about the 442 Regimental Combat Team, these are cornerstones in our foundation as a community, as a American culture. But that's the past, that's our history. How does it resonate into the future? So that's the question about our Nikkei Nation. And you know, we have to adjust and change just like our communities changed. My oldest son is married to a Japanese American woman, our granddaughter's 6th generation. My second son is married to a ethnically Chinese woman that's families from Vietnam. They were both people, so they're truly Asian American. Most families I know in the Japanese community have one child that's married to a non-Japanese. So our community is changing, but it's still the same community. It's just a matter of expanding who's a part of our community and who's a part of the community family. And I got to tell you, David, I look at my sons in particular and my friends' children, I'm amazed. They're so smart. They have so many skill sets. But the thing that really amazes me is they're good people. They are good people. So I talked to my sons, my oldest son, why don't you run for the Torrance School Board because your daughter's going to Torrance schools. And he said, wait a minute, Dad, you already gave it the office. We know what politics is about. But they're going to be involved in their community. They both do social media. I think the Japanese American community is in great shape. We have our festivals at the JCIs and our community centers, our temples. We have our Obon dances. We have Little Tokyo. We have San Jose. We have Nihonmachi in San Francisco. We need to keep them to keep our community anchored, but anchored so we can go out far and wide as a community, as individuals in that community, with our touchstones, reaching back to stay really healthy as a community, really vibrant as a community. And, you know, I'm excited about the Japanese American community. I'm excited about Asian American community. We're the fastest growing along with Latinos. All my political work, I deal with the Latinos. The Latinos are the power in California, and so are the Asians, if we realize that. So it's an exciting time, I think, with all the negative stuff in this Trump era. I just wrote a column for the Rafu Shimpo, and I said, ex-president, as I wrote it in my column, and that just felt so good, ex-president. But what does the future hold? What do we have? We have to make our own future. Joe Biden ain't gonna make it for us. We have to make it.
Well stated. Beautiful. Dale, what about you? What's your thoughts as we go into the future? And you're muted, by the way.
That idea I've been thinking about for a long time because demographics have shown the outmarriage of Japanese Americans is over 50%. So what's happening is you're having less people of ethnic Japanese origin, and it says to me that what you have to do is expand the notion of what does it mean to be a, quote, Nikkei nation. If you're sticking to just being part Japanese, I mean, just Japanese only, I think you're going to not dilute, but you will lessen the numbers. So we're facing some challenges here. I think what we have to do is embrace folks who are culturally Japanese, and it doesn't matter almost what race they are. You don't need to be 1/8 Japanese or 1/16. If you ascribe to like preserving a Japantown, there are only 3 left in this country, and the one in San Francisco is dying, and is dying because of COVID-19. And so we don't know where the future is with that core geographic area that draws people together. So I'm a bit more pessimistic than Warren is. I do believe that if people can be more inclusive and bring in more Japanese Americans or expanding the definition, I do think that we can continue to present like an ethnic identity and a cultural identity that is really important for the contributions it's made to this country.
Beautifully stated too, and very important to save Japantown for sure. Mike Hondo, what about you?
Yeah, I think that Japantown and all the camps, the kinds of things we're doing right now are important. But the question of Nikkei Nation, now we could approach that question about in fear that we're going to be absorbed and disappear. But if we stick to our, the facts, and we teach our children who we are, where we came from, and what we're all about, then I think our story and our contributions will go from generation to generation. Because, my son, like Warren, my son married a Chinese ethnic who's fifth generation Indonesian. She doesn't speak Mandarin, Cantonese, but she speaks Chaozhou and Indonesian. My daughter married a gentleman that's half white and half Mexican. Well, I shouldn't say half white, I should a blended background of Latino or Mexican and white. So terminology into the future for at least the Nikkei nation is, I want us to be careful about how we use terminologies. And when our kids say, well, I'm half this and half that, and as a teacher, I used to ask, which half? Really, biologically, you're blended. And so, we become a blended Nikkei nation in the future. But the key is we take our story, we take our history, we take our heritage, and we blend that into the future, and we teach that forward. And the kind of expectation that we want for our nation is that kind of understanding, is that we learn the truth about who we are and our contributions. And you asked a question earlier about how did it happen in our camp? How did we happen to get into camp? It's because the media and technology was controlled by certain groups like.
Oh,
Muted.
Mike, you're on mute.
Oh,
Yeah, there you go.
Randall Hearst says it's my job to mold public opinion, and he did through yellow journalism. And yellow journalism initially didn't start with Asians. It started between Pulitzer and Randall and those newspapers who were trying to sell papers through what you call sensationalism and stereotypes of people on the East Coast. But it translated into anti-Chinese, anti-Asian, and finally it affected us. So we have to really be careful about the facts that are out there, be able to understand technology. And today's technology allows us to have real time, and distance doesn't make a difference if we keep telling the story and keep telling the facts, so that in spite of the fact that we had a president who didn't like his job and a president who kept talking about fake news, the fact remains that in the media, there were still people out there who wanted to keep telling the truth and keep looking for the facts. And as citizens, as a Nikkei nation moving forward, we have to keep teaching ourselves to look for the facts and be critical consumers of goods and information. And I think that that should be the future of our Nikkei nation, because immigration from Japan is not going to happen the way it has happened in other nations because of war and because of famine and because of climate change. So we just have to be able to understand who we are and hang on to that and teach that one generation to the next.
Absolutely. Well said. Secretary Mineta, can you add to this conversation just really briefly? What do you see for the future of the Nikkei community?
Well, I have a great deal of hope about the future because, again, the nature of technology and the nature of the education and the drive of young people is setting new contours. And sure, we have to look in the rearview mirror, but it's much more important that we keep a strong hand on the steering wheel and look to the future about where we're going. And so it is important that our young people understand this history, but not rely on it, because again, young people today weren't even born when 9/11 occurred. So again, today I have a great deal of faith and a great deal of hope for future generations, because they have the means and the knowledge and the drive to set that new course, not only for themselves, but for their families. So again, I just want to thank all of you for participating in today's session. Just really enlightening, and thanks for your past contributions to where we are today.
Beautiful. Thank you, Secretary. And finally, Shirley, what do you see for the future?
I think I'm generally optimistic, and I agree with all the panelists that there's a lot to be hopeful for, although there are a lot of challenges. I think for me, I think what's important is that we continue to write books, we continue to make movies and films, we continue to participate in the media, and we participate in communication. The reality is, if we don't communicate the information, people will not understand. And I'm hoping that we could do that with the Mineta Simpson Institute. We're getting a lot of traction. I also believe that we should collaborate and have exchange programs with Japan. The Japanese government is actually contributing to part of our resources in terms of our content in the Mineta Simpson Institute. But, the bottom line is, really preserving the Japanese culture is what our parents and our grandparents did when they came to the United States. And I think that connection to Japan is very important to the Nikkei community. So I'd like to really continue that trajectory.
Super important point. Shirley, it's been great. To all of our panelists, it's been a real honor to talk to you. We've learned so much, and we need to do a lot more of this and learn from the folks who have fought this fight for so long. It's been a real pleasure. And with that, I want to send it back over to Adina. Thank you so much for having us, Adina.
Thank you all so much for being here. And as a Japanese American who's Yonsei and a millennial, I definitely hear your words, and I think our history is so important, and I see it as my duty to keep telling these stories as well. It's one of the reasons why I'm in law school. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you, David, so much for moderating so skillfully. I want to remind folks to please purchase the book, Setsuko's Secret, Heart Mountain and the Legacy of the Japanese American Incarceration. You've heard all about it. I know I'm going to purchase my copy right after this. You can go to the Heart Mountain, Wyoming Foundation store, the JAM store, the Japanese American Museum of San Jose. Nikkei Traditions in San Jose, Japantown will be coming soon. And we want to thank the co-sponsors for today's events, the Ventura County JACL, San Jose JACL, and the Japanese American Citizens League. Our hosts are the Japanese American Museum of San Jose. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a volunteer, and the Heart Mountain, Wyoming Foundation. we want to ask folks to please consider to becoming a member or making a donation to these two different organizations, both the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation and the Japanese American Museum of San Jose. The links will actually be in the chat, so you can click right there directly. I'm a member of the Japanese American Museum of San Jose, and I find it very worthwhile. We hope you'll join us in that. Thank you again for participating and for being here. I know that there are folks from all over the country. I think it's especially important that folks outside of the Japanese American community are here as well, because we need to make sure the story is told outside of the community, and so that we can keep our history alive. Thank you all so much for being here.